Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome host, CNN GPS, Fareed Zakaria.
Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to be here and a great pleasure to participate in President Clinton's extraordinary global initiative that moves from strength to strength every year. I think it is only a matter of time when someone will refer to the UN General Assembly as that event that takes place after the Clinton Global Initiative that involves some heads of state. What I thought we'd do is, since we have this extraordinary panel, we are going to talk about the future of the global economy, of the American economy, and the opportunities that are presented in that economy. Let me set the stage with something of a confession. I come to this as something of an optimist. You can see the world two ways, I suppose. My old friend George Will, with whom I used to debate on the Stephanopoulos show, often said to me that he thought it was silly that I was an optimist. He said it makes much more sense to be a pessimist. Most of the time you're right, and when you're wrong, you're pleasantly surprised. I persist in optimism, and part of it may be a product of just my own life. I began thinking about coming to America in the late 1970s. If you think things look bad now, think about the 1970s, right? This was an era of stagflation. It was a few years after Watergate in Vietnam. The United States seemed on the decline, in retreat. The Soviet Union was expanding. And then by the early 1980s, you begin the start of a big boom, by the end of which it turns out it is the Soviet Union that is not just appears to be declining, but is indeed collapsing. And yet, we go through our paroxysms every time there is a crisis, right? If you remember 1987, when the Dow dropped 22% in one day, still the largest point drop the Dow has ever had, and everyone said, it's all over. In fact, John Kenneth Galbraith wrote an article in the New York Times saying this is our version of the crash of '29. We're about to experience our version of the depression of the 1930s. Well, I think it took a week for the market to return to normal. The economy had barely budged. If you think about the recession of 91, 92, it was seen as sufficiently severe that it unseated a sitting president of the United States who had just presided over victory in the Cold War, victory in the first Gulf War, had a 91% approval rating, and he was unseated by a then, is one allowed to say, relatively unknown governor from Arkansas. That tells you something about the level of economic anxiety in the country at the time. And yet, it produced a third-party candidate, Ross Perot, who was going to speak to the economic anxieties of ordinary Americans. Whenever this happens in America, the guy speaking to those anxieties tends to be a billionaire. But, Donald Trump tried to play that role in this current election. It didn't quite work out. But soon, what you were confronting was not Ross Perot's great sucking sound of jobs going from the United States to Mexico, but a different problem, which is economists couldn't figure out how the United States could drop its unemployment rate so low without triggering inflation. This was something actually no economic textbook had figured out. And the Clinton boom, which ends up producing about 25 million private sector jobs, goes on in a way that literally defies the economic textbooks of the time. But of course, that isn't how we saw it then. In those days, we went through the Mexican crisis, which morphed into the Asian crisis, and everyone said, emerging markets were a fad and they were over. There was a cover story in Fortune magazine called "The Myth of Asia's Miracle." By the time we get through that, 97, it seems all Asian markets are back on track. But of course, that gets you to 98. The Russians default, long-term capital management explodes. Robert Rubin, Bill Clinton's Secretary of Treasury, says this is the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. 1 week later, the Fed organizes a bailout that it insists was not a bailout. And Russia pays a price, but there's very little contagion. You think you're clear and off to the races, but of course that gets you to March 2000. The NASDAQ crashes, $3 trillion wiped off American stock exchanges, and everyone's sure emerging markets may not have been a bubble, but technology certainly was a bubble, right? I mean, all those crazy companies that were really websites that kids used with no business model that anyone understood, that we were never going to see any of that again. until somebody founded MySpace and Facebook and Twitter and Groupon and Instagram, and I could go on, and John Chambers could really go on. And all of them, or many of them, continue to thrive and prosper. And then we get to our crisis. And I don't mean by this we're not going through a very deep crisis. What I'm pointing out is the incredible resilience of this global system, the incredible resilience to be able to, in some way or the other, come back. And so what we're going to try and talk about is that going to happen this time? And what are the contours of it? And the part that I'm most interested in exploring with this extraordinary panel is one piece of it. One of the reasons we've had this resilience, this extraordinary bounce back, has been two great forces that have been at work. Technology, the information revolution that you all know about, and globalization, the extraordinary spread of economic growth across the world. The number of countries growing at 3% a year in 1979 was about 32. The number of countries growing at 3% a year in 2007 was 124. Even this year it will be 85 after the crash. So those two forces have powered this extraordinary rise. But there is one other piece to it. If you look at America's unemployment, and you look at how we have recovered from recessions, from 1945 to 1990, there was a typical pattern. The economy came back, the GDP came back, and then jobs came back. Unemployment went back to its pre-crisis levels. The gap was 6 months, from 1945 to 1990. From 1990, that gap began to widen. The recession of the early 1990s, the GDP comes back and jobs come back 15 months later. The recession of the early 2000s, GDP comes back and jobs come back 29 months later. This current recession, McKinsey predicts that the jobs will come back 65 months after the GDP has come back, 5.5 years later. And so you ask yourself, what happened in these last 20 years that has made this happen? And one can't but reflect on the fact that, well, the two great forces that have been powering the world for the last 20 years have been globalization and technology. And while it has been extraordinary for aggregate GDP, it has been great for companies, it has been great for capital, it has been very tough on the average American worker, one might say the average Western worker. And how you resolve this conundrum of the extraordinary potential of the global economy and the challenges it places in certain areas, particularly when dealing with American workers, is one of the many themes we're going to talk about. I'm going to stop talking because we have an extraordinary panel here, and I'd like to get to them as quickly as I can. So if I may ask the panel to join me, I'm going to get over here and then introduce them as they sit down. None of them need introduction. Lloyd, you're first. Okay. We have really three of the smartest businessmen in the world, and it's an extraordinary pleasure for me, but a pleasure and honor for all of us to have a chance to get their perspectives. Lloyd Blankfein, of course, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, Andrew Liveris, the CEO of Dow Chemical, John Chambers, the CEO of Cisco. When we put together a dream list of CEOs that we would like to get, we wanted to get people who were extraordinarily accomplished, extraordinarily talented, with track records that were the envy of people in the business world, and from three very different perspectives. And somehow, sometimes you get your first choices in a dance, and we managed. So we're very grateful.
A little bit of pressure.
By definition, we're the first choice.
All right. Gentlemen, welcome. Lloyd, let me start with you. When you look at the global economy, right now, what is it, 4 years after the crash, what does it look like to you?
Well, we're definitely in a muddle-through phase, slow growth, very disappointing. But I think one of the things that was achieved, and by the way, in hindsight, this may look small, but while we were living through it was very large, there was a very substantial chance, too substantial to live with, of things falling off the rail. They're still out there, and a lot of the things that would foster growth are still uncertain and are still, frankly, they're still in the forward. But I think what was taken off the table recently by the central banks acting by themselves and less by governments through fiscal policy was the real blow-up risk. So if you think of a couple of places in the world that we were the most afraid of, like Europe, I think the actions of the ECB to at least defer the problems with the sovereigns and the bank issues in Europe. If they use this time to fix those problems, we'll look back and think it was a good thing. If they've merely deferred them and made them worse in the long term, we won't feel that way. I think something similar has happened in the United States, whereby a lot of liquidity has been provided by the central bank.
So you applaud Ben Bernanke's recent moves to enhance liquidity?
I think given his mandate to fight inflation and to pursue growth, I think, frankly, he has no choice but to exercise those powers. There's no inflation on the horizon. Of course, there's inflationary fears in the long run, but you have the clear and present danger of a deflationary position. And if you'd ask me to weigh the consequences of the two, I would say there's a playbook for dealing with inflation, and there's no real playbook for dealing with deflation, where every day you come in and decide, maybe I better wait for tomorrow when things are cheaper. And so given how much water has passed under the bridge, I would certainly invest a little bit more to make sure we didn't bend back into deflation. I think that's good policy. He has something more than a judgment as to whether it's a good trade-off or not. He has the mandate from Congress to pursue, with an equal measure, growth or anti-inflation behavior, and frankly, the growth issue is much more prominent.
Andrew, you have operations almost all over the world. What is your sense of growth? Because there are troubling reports about growth slowing down in the emerging markets, which have so far been a very powerful lifeline for global growth as the United States and Europe weakened, particularly China, where you do a lot of business.
Let me start where you started, which is optimism. So I don't think we're going to have an 08-09 scenario, and I think we'd all agree with that. Liquidity is out there for the reasons Lloyd was addressing. I do think the world since 08-09 to now has not got a normal. We don't know what normal demand is. And of course the obvious, which is consumption in the US is not where it was in the pre-08 period. What's replaced that is government stimuli around the world that has been ineffective in the main. The first Chinese one was very effective. The situation in China right now, I would say in the B2B industrial world, is we haven't seen this even in the 08-09 period. They're at, in my view, somewhere in the 2% range of growth, not 6, not 7. And that's in the industrial engine. Thousands and thousands of small mediums are having trouble. Our supply chains are weak. And of course, the slow motion train wreck that is Europe, and if I can be optimistic there, let's say they're on the rails again. They just need people to drive the trains. So we can maybe get back to Europe later. But certainly that hurt them more than they thought, they being China. In March, China was talking about a smooth political transition and an economic transition from investment to consumption. And they're going to do that domestically. They are. But they're not having a smooth transition, to state the obvious. And it's affected all their state-owned enterprises. And all of the consumption out there is not materializing. Exports aren't there. And they're putting in more stimulus. We're seeing that in our business. China's extremely weak. Europe is what it is. The emerging world feeds off of China's growth. So maybe I can finish my run around the world with the one optimistic place we should be thinking very positive about, which is the United States. We have a strong hand right now. Our political process is not allowing us to play it. Capital is a coward. Businesses hate uncertainty. We have uncertainty even in this country on things that matter, not the least of them being our phenomenal energy position, which I can talk more about if you wish. But I would say to you, it's not a 3% world. It's not even a 2 and 2.5% world at this very moment. Outlook-wise, I think post-November, maybe the US gets its act together, whoever the president is, and business and government work together, finally, to really get this economy where it needs to go. So it's not just 65 months, whatever you said, but not more than that of a jobless recovery.
John, whenever we have these conversations, when it turns to technology, the hope is that somehow you guys will magically bring us out of all this, that technology is going to be the thing that gets the American economy moving again. Mm-hmm. If we are to look for the next drivers of growth, mm-hmm. do you see them in technology?
I absolutely do. And if you really look at the opportunities, you go around the world, much as my colleagues have done, and we see the picture remarkably similar. If you look at Europe, you not only see a weakening economy, but you also see, as we said in our last quarter reports, the spending on capital start to drop a lot. Same with job creation. I do not think that Asia Pacific will be as aggressive as we hope they would be in China and India, although, Andrew, I'm a little bit more optimistic on China. I've been there for 25 years. They always find a way to get through. But I think the common takeaway here is this country in the U.S. is known for its entrepreneurial spirit, and unfortunately, it has to be the country that leads out this time. We just do not see the engines in other places. You watch what is occurring in the large enterprise, the commercial markets, that will be the indication of which way we go. We unfortunately have been pretty accurate in 2007 about the financial slowdown that occurred 9 months later. Similar scenario in 2009 about getting optimistic, and again in 2011 about being conservative. So we do get to listen to our customers fairly carefully, but I think technology combined with a great education system and government and business really working together, and I think this is what we're missing around the world. A model like what has occurred in the UK or what is occurring in Canada or even in Russia might be something that we could learn from. But I believe it will be the U.S. that leads us out.
Wait, so follow up on that. You say government-business cooperation is what we need, the kind we have in the United Kingdom, the kind you have in Canada, and even in Russia. You find it easier to deal with Putin's Russia than the United States?
Well, you are a pro at this, and no matter which way I answer this one, I'm in trouble. But to the point of commonality, each of those leaders understands technology can create jobs. Each of those leaders know that if you're in an extraction industry like Russia, you've got to create a middle class or you don't have political stability. You've got to keep your young people at home. You've got to create new jobs, etc. And they're willing to work very closely in public-private partnerships to create these new generations of companies. In the UK, Prime Minister Cameron, when he did the Olympics, he wasn't after an event. He was after innovation for his country. We partner with them in terms of putting innovation centers across the country. We looked at East London and how do you really make it prosper after the Olympics finished. You begin to invest in the UK, where we spent $5 billion on our last acquisition, and half of our engineers, half of our people in the UK are now engineers. Prime Minister Harper in Canada, he makes it easy to do business there. It's easy to go make a $500 million commitment there. They'll say, here's what we'll do together. They work very closely. And I think President Clinton said it best in his opening comments. He said there's not a developed country in the world that isn't realizing the power of public-private partnerships. I think we must do much better in the U.S.
But so how badly do we do in the U.S.? Can you, when you contrast your dealings in Washington with your dealings in London, in Canada, and Russia, what's your conclusion?
I think we have a country that dreams well. I think we've got to be more effective on our execution.
Lloyd, you've had a few experiences with government regulation, and what would you say?
Well, I think we have a culture now where there's almost a reluctance by government to engage with business or to admit, when you have articles that are done in a provocative style, that to the point that the Treasury Secretary has even met with heads of Wall Street banks as if that were a bad thing and not a good thing, you understand a little bit about what the culture is. And it's not just a culture that comes from government, it's a culture that government has been subjected to. It's a combination of things, and of course the recency of the trauma has contributed to that, and we're all victims of that to some extent. But we have to get away from that. The optimistic side, as you go around the world and you think of trouble spots and you think of, hard or soft landing in China, Europe going off the rails with the euro, you think of the Middle East. In the United States, it's the one area where it just seems that the problems are the most self-inflicted and the ones that can most easily be resolved by people coming together. What percentage of the problems that affect the forward of business, going forward and making decisions, would be resolved if we could just come up with a budget within parameters, not even the specific budget that you or I or you would want, but just coming up with some sort of a compromise on a budget? Where else in the world can you have problems that loom so large, so substantial a portion of which could be resolved by just that?
But if you turn to the positives, and anytime you feel kind of down, just go to Silicon Valley. I mean, the ability to dream in the Valley is amazing, and they make dreams happen. But there's a risk-taking culture that you must have to be successful in countries and companies. And also a realization the day that you don't take risk or you try to cover every single base so that nobody will second guess you, you're a company that is history. So I think how we take what we do best in this country and best around the world, and it isn't unique to the U.S., it's the ability to really have entrepreneurism and innovation flourish. It's the ability of government and business to work together, not just to get jobs, but also address the key social needs, the environment, healthcare together, etc. And I think we do that remarkably well through technology. So I'm the optimist in the longer term.
Lloyd, so let me be specific. Do you think that Dodd-Frank has tried to take too much risk out of finance? In other words, there is in any business, you want there to be a healthy amount of risk. That's what makes capitalism work. But on the regulatory side, clearly the fear is, well, these things are risky. Has Dodd-Frank gone too far?
Probably has gone too far, but just think of it in context. The summer after we had 4 hurricanes on the eastern end of Long Island, how much would you have paid for insurance the next year? A lot more than the year before those hurricanes, yet the risk was really the same. The recency of the trauma has made everybody risk adverse. And again, what risk you want to take with the system is something, given that it has such a big effect on the body politic and society, I think it's partly it's largely a political question of where you want risk and reward. I think it's our job to explain to people what the consequences are of stamping out all the risk. If you had to manage these firms, any firm, so that you would do well or survive the 100-year storm, you'd have a very awful 99 years in between those 100-year storms. And so you have to come to the right balance. Will that pendulum swing too far at first? Predictably, yes. But then I think cooler heads will prevail because people will decide, gee, there's less risk-taking by banks, less lending go on, less risky loans, less investment in entrepreneurs. We'd like to make that adjustment. It would be great if we could get it the first time out, but it tends not to happen that way. The Depression was in 1929. You had the Securities and Exchange Act of 33, 34, 35, 37, 39, and it kept going. I think there'll be adjustments to these things. So I'm not surprised where we are. But the crisp answer to your question, yes, it will. There's a lot of belts and suspenders. Firms need to have more capital, but there are a lot of different things that are compounding that to make it less risky, even beyond the additional capital.
Andrew, you operate around the world. Would you say that the dangers or the problems of investing capital in America have gotten worse?
No, I actually think they've gotten better despite all the framework that Lloyd and all of us are feeling from the regulatory side. Actually, the innovation point John made, plus I'd also go to Texas and go applaud at the places that have discovered shale and what we've done with that and what we keep doing with that. The country innovates and moves quickly, and some of these things we're talking about, America is not in terminal decline. America's in a passage through a very stormy period where the voice of business needs to elevate to meet the voice of government and do it as a partner. And I think it falls on us, and I happen to believe my colleagues here are examples where they're willing to step up and talk. And you do get a lot of critique. The media doesn't do this right. We have to keep doing it better to understand how to use the channels to communicate to the ordinary person out in the street. When I'm in front of our factory workers and we talk about the pride in the products they can now export from America, thanks to American entrepreneurialism, thanks to American innovation. I'm not an American, and I think this country has nailed it in terms of human history and putting the right model in place. So we should allow ourselves some faults. We should allow ourselves the opportunity to dialogue and not be afraid. And business needs to elevate to where the debate has gone to, and not complain that it's just politics. Equally, politics has to get away from this notion that we have a 4-year or 3.5-year election process, which is a joke. A whole year, this year, of doing nothing, which is in essence what we've got. We've got a Jobs Council report, an Advanced Manufacturing report, an Export Council report, lots of work on the financial side, all sitting there in inaction, because we can't get a White House and a Congress to agree on fixing the problems of the day.
You're on several of President Obama's.
Several of those. Yeah, so I'm looking at me when I say all this.
No, but I want to ask you a different question.
Yes.
What do you think of President Obama? Because you were a business leader who's actually worked with him.
Is this going to get me deported?
It depends on your answer.
I don't know what it does to you. Look, we serve the country, we serve our president. And I am proud to serve this president. I am proud to serve a president who follows this president. If it's the same president, great. I happen to believe it's the two issues I just talked about. And John talked about one, I think Lloyd amplified it. Countries are competing like companies. Okay, it's in my book, you know that.
Yes.
So I get attracted, the proverbial red carpet, to go to places of risky political jurisdictions, but actually decent business environments. Now you got to titrate that, right? How risky is risk on the political front versus decent business environment, tax, regulation, all the things, energy, all the things that they provide. And they have strategies. We don't have such a thing in this democracy. By the way, most democracies don't. I happen to think the Greeks, and I'm of Greek descent, another disclosure, and by the way, brand Greece is not the last 10 years. Brand Greece is 2,500 years. Okay, so when you think about a word, don't think about the last thing you read. Okay,
They need to hire you. They need to hire you as
well,
the
what I'm
spokesman.
saying is Samaras is trying to do the right things, working with business and government. So is this president. Has he surrounded himself with people who know what those right things are? Have we in the business community tried? We have. And I think we've got to keep trying, but we can't do anything right now because nothing will happen until post-November.
John Chambers, you have lavish praise on President Clinton, publicly and privately.
It's hard for a Republican.
Hard for a
But
Republican.
he's created the most jobs. He's done the best job during my lifetime.
Do you think President Obama has been a different kind of Democrat?
Let me answer your question a little bit indirectly, if I may, and I know I'm answering it indirectly. I'm looking over your shoulder at the Clinton Global Initiative. He brought us together, businesses, government, NGOs, to solve common problems. He said, put your politics at the door, and it's amazing what you can accomplish. Leaders who get that, and watch what happened when he turned around the economy. He took over with a $290 billion deficit, and he left with a $236 billion surplus. 17% growth in real GDP in terms of the earnings for the citizens of this country. And he partnered with business and government to solve it. And he was tough on us where appropriate, and still is. But he just outlined very simple principles, which we all got. He said, we've got to deal with our deficit. He then said we've got to empower people and businesses to work together. And he said we're going to compete in a global open market. Now what's fascinating is those conversations occur in Jordan and Palestinian territories in Israel more often than they do now here. And when you talk to President Abbas in Palestine, he knows that if you invest with him, which we do, you can change a country. You put $10 million in, and all of a sudden, GDP from high tech goes from 0.5% to 5%. King Abdullah in Jordan clearly understands that. President Perez and Prime Minister Netanyahu understand it in Israel, and you can partner to say, how do we accomplish those goals? So I think it's one that we can learn a lot from. I think President Clinton is a great example of that, bringing us together. And I think that's what we need, regardless of who wins the election.
Lloyd, Goldman Sachs was, I think, the largest contributor to President Obama's campaign the last time around. I'm guessing, I think the numbers show that is not the case this time. Does that surprise you? Why has support for President Obama dropped so dramatically in the financial community?
Well, just to clarify, Goldman Sachs doesn't contribute to these campaigns.
No, it's individuals within them. Yeah.
And we're kind of a mixed bag. We're also a big contributor to the Republicans 4 years ago, and a big contributor to the Democrats this year. But there certainly has been a shift. I think there's been a disappointment owing to some of the things that have just been described and working together. There has to be, risk taking is not just the risk that we take, and not just financial risk. The environment has gotten such a got you environment that even the politicians themselves and regulators have to do their business with one eye over the shoulders for fear of being dragged into some congressional committee, or they'll be exposed for having to talk to leaders and gotten their opinions, and they didn't have as many meetings with unions as they did with the people who are running the companies who are making the economic decisions. And that has kind of displaced the real working environment. Sometimes, putting myself into other people's positions, I'm not sure that the risk hasn't gotten greater on the public servants who don't get paid a lot of money necessarily for what they do, but frankly have been a little bit tortured in the environment that they're in. So I think this idea of working together, I think in order to allow people to work together, there has to be a little bit of a let-up. Another thing is you can't kill people if everything doesn't work out perfectly. Who the heck is going to take the jobs, both in business and in government? You know, you'll always get people who want to be CEO, and you'll always get people who want to be senators and cabinet secretaries, but it might not be the people you want if you make it so punishing for them to take the job and so unsustainable to be in the job, because who gets it right all the time?
That's actually an important distinction John Chambers and I were talking about. In business, you assume that you make decisions, you take risks, some of them work out and some of them don't. In government, it's very difficult to take risks, because if something goes badly, you're going to get pilloried for it. There's no particular reward for having gotten it right. And so the balance that you worry about is very different, right?
It is. Business has an advantage in that we know if we don't take risk, it's about survival. And we have a great number of competitors every year. What's been interesting is those from 15 to 20 years ago are no longer there. And from 10 to 15, only one survived. It's a culture that if you don't change, you will hurt your employees, you will hurt your customers, you will hurt your shareholders. And this is where I think business also has to stand behind our government leaders who take risk and encourage the country and every country around the world that if government leaders don't take risk, especially during the tough times, and we were talking earlier, I think that's what leadership's about. It's not leading during the good times. It's getting a turnaround to take place, and in order to do that, you have to take risk. And then we've got to come together, whether it's in Europe, whether it's the U.S., whether it's in China, behind those common risk-taking. The Chinese will take risk. I would argue the Canadians will take risk, and I think we need to do the same thing here.
Andrew, would you agree that even among, the Chinese, put them aside, they have demonstrated a track record. They also have certain, shall we say, abilities because of their political system that you don't have in a democracy. But would you agree with John Chambers that right now, when you look at other advanced industrial democracies, they are better run and their governments are more sort of competent and pro-growth than the United States?
I would say, I would agree, and I would also say the UK, Italy, Germany, I would actually put Australia, my home country, into that. Even Singapore, which I would count as Canada, definitely.
Is this everyone just for short?
Yeah. I'm trying to think who isn't. Maybe that's a better way to think it. I don't think Spain's there yet. So the developed world who has, if you like, reached the cusp of what growth looked like post-World War II, has decided that a pro-innovation strategy in a multi-sectorial conversation, a strategy, maybe not a Chinese 5-year plan, which is obviously very top-down, but really inviting in leaders of their enterprises, foreign as well. They bring in foreign CEOs. They sit down and they have conversations about, well, what's my incumbency, what's my competitive advantage, and how do I diversify my risk? Let me take Australia or Canada. They have a risk profile on commodities to China. How do I diversify my risk, take that risk down by getting into advanced manufacturing? They're having those conversations with companies like ours. Much easier, much more fluid, and doesn't seem to be adversarial, to Lloyd's point.
Yeah. Let me just say something else, because we're not sure, and we may look back at this and think differently about it later, but let me just lay the grounding. What you don't know about China is you don't know that they have the mechanisms in place to identify and resolve their mistakes. If you go out and you do a program where you drive loans and you spur the economy and you spend $600 billion or $1 trillion, you're not going, and you build 80 airports, all 80 of them are not going to be in the right place. Some of those roads are going to go nowhere. Some things are going to be built too fast, built incorrectly, not be the right thing. And one thing in this country, we have, the market here is very cruel, and you can, and forces you to resolve your mistakes quickly. It may well be, and I agree, that China is great, but this may be the century of China for all I know, but they're not going to own every year. And at some point, it's going to come home to roost that some of the money that they spent so very quickly is going to have to be written off, and some of those loans are going to have to be written off, and I'm just not entirely sure when that comes. One thing our system is good at is adjusting, but I will tell you, it's a lot easier to work in a place that has a central point, and it may be a little bit harder to admit failure in a place that has a central point.
I just want to jump on that point because I totally agree with that. And let me give you an example of why I think they actually get your point. Hank Paulson, one of your predecessors, brought 5 global CEOs on the Chinese government's request, into what is in essence their association of state-owned enterprises. They have such a thing. Their vice premier and the head of that association, whose name escapes me right now, and 80 of their state-owned enterprise CEOs were in a room for 2 days, and we were teaching them Lloyd's point, how to globalize in a world where you have a market that's cruel, that you can't have state funds anymore. And I got to tell you, it was a surreal sight. They were in classroom setting, all in the same uniforms, all CEOs of some of the world's largest companies already, some of them successful global brands already. But they were there to learn Lloyd's point. They understand that point. The transition's going to be hard, but they get it. And I think it won't be China's century in the traditional way we think it's going to be China's century. I think it could be America's century if we partner with where China wants to go. Sustainable manufacturing, sustainable use of resources, the word sustainability. I think that's the opportunity.
Sure.
I think the key takeaway here is 2 points. First, what Lloyd and Andrew said is absolutely true. We've been teaching classes for both the business community group, state-owned enterprises and others for 5 years, but also for all their government leaders. And they have a process for their government leaders that makes GE's process for their development of their leaders look archaic. But their competency over the last 5 years, every group coming through, I mean, it's like the current group, they open up all their computers, all their iPads, they are off and running. The questions are tough, but they're there to learn. What's the second key part of the takeaway? They come to America. They come to learn from us. And I think we can work together in a very unique win-win. But what we can also do is come out of this economic downturn by governments and business working together around the world. And that's really, I think, our echo here. Let's start taking good business risk again. Hold us accountable if we make mistakes, and I think all of us would agree on that. But it's our time to lead again.
I think a good start would be not to have anybody feel anxious about appearing in the same room with people, with business and government.
Let me ask you guys a question. Lloyd, the biggest immediate danger for the U.S. economy and therefore the global economy is the so-called fiscal cliff. How real is it, and how do you prepare for something like that?
No, it's real. I mean, the numbers are there, and the law is cast, and the math, the economists have divined, and this seems to be a consensus, that it could be 4% of GDP. I think it was meant to be somewhat of a ticking time bomb to prompt action. I don't think anybody's going to be pleased if it doesn't produce action. Obviously, people have written off the period up to the election and putting their faith in a lame duck session to do some work. I don't think a lot of work can be done, but maybe at the most optimistic, there can be some rejiggering, rearrangement, some deferring. But if they got something done, medium hanging fruit, and then said we have a structure in place, and maybe by the middle of the year, we come up with a whole program and set ourselves that real deadline and agree to work together. And I'm somewhat optimistic that, again, after the election, regardless of who wins and regardless of where the compromise gets set, people who have been pouting for 18 months and holding their breath aren't going to want to do that for another 4 years, so there'll be some movement towards compromise and getting it out. That gives me some optimism, but this was supposed to be, there was a time, the timer was set, it was supposed to prompt action, and there is a substantial risk that we don't get action. And that will be very, very bad for the rating. And it won't just be because of our credit. It will be because of the dysfunctionality of the government. And we will deserve to be graded as a dysfunctional government. And who wants to lend money to a dysfunctional government? And why should we be the reserve currency of the world if we can't manage the health of the economy and therefore the value of the currency? The U.S. is an amazing beneficiary of being the reserve currency. I think people should start realizing that that's the real ticking time bomb.
John Chambers, you're a Republican. President Obama says, look, this budget issue could be solved very simply if the Republicans would agree to some tax increases, that the math tells you that there's simply no way to come up with a budget deal that brings the deficit down without tax increases. And Mitt Romney, the nominee, said, and during a Republican debate, he would not take $10 of spending cuts for $1 of tax increase. Is it fair to say that that obstinacy is at the heart of the problem?
I can't speak on behalf of the Republican Party, and I support as many Democrats as I do Republicans, just for full disclosure. I think what we have to do is get back to outlining the plan that people believe in. And if you don't have a plan you believe in, you're not going to invest as a business person or as a consumer. And I think we've got to come together as a country and say, here's what we're going to do over the next 3 to 5 years. Here are going to be our top priorities we're going to deal with. I have no problem paying more as an individual citizen, and I think I should, as long as I know that if I pay that, we'll step up to our problems as opposed to just kick the can further down the block in terms of the approach. So I think it's a unique opportunity. We were talking before, leadership is about leading during the tough times. It's not about leading during the good times, even though that's when you get all the press and everybody says nice things about you. You learn more about yourself as a leader, as a company or a country, and leading through the tough times. I think we can execute in a remarkable way, and I don't think it's particularly complex on how we go about it. We deal with the deficit. We invest in people and companies. We realize that we have to pull the rest of the world out of this, and we say, how do we do it together? Issues of company taxation. You can't be competitive on a global basis with jobs here unless you change the tax system, which was built in 1986 before Microsoft went public and before Facebook was even a dream. And so we're dealing with an unreal world that actually encourages you not to bring your money that you earn overseas, where most of our growth will be, back and invest in this country no matter how much you want it to be. So I think we outline a very crisp plan of how to get there. Let's get both sides to come together. And I think America deserves that after the election, regardless of who wins.
Let's talk about the issue of unemployment, jobs, and the American worker. Because you can imagine reasonable growth, as we've had over the last 10 years, for example, with almost no job growth. Andrew Liveris, you have been arguing that manufacturing can come back to the United States. We have 600,000 jobs that have come back, but over the last 20 years, we've lost 4 million. So in other words, the long-term trend has been one of declining manufacturing. Do you really think you can turn that trend around?
Yeah, so the Advanced Manufacturing Partnership, when it gets implemented post-November, has identified 11 enabling technologies that the United States, including several of your world, John, that if we put together a cohesive approach between government, business, and academia. In fact, they've run a pilot already on one of them, a national additive manufacturing strategy. And that pilot, what it fundamentally means is the funds are out there. So the government's spending this money anyway, your money. So fundamentally, if I can direct the fund against these 11 technologies, and then I can get a business to come in and say, I want to be part of that, and I'm going to do some shared IP, I can do more Silicon Valleys. I can create another 11 Silicon Valleys based on these new technologies. And we have the leadership already in pockets, in a university here, or a government there, or a government department, or a company here. And what we need to do is find a way to actually bring this money so we can innovate and create sectors around them, like Silicon Valley, and create employment around those sectors. That's a deliberate approach, not to go back to America's past, not to go to one sector and say, I only want that sector, because we never do this, the market does it. So I'm just going to be financial services. Well, that doesn't work, you know. I mean, look at the UK. I can't let manufacturing bleed away to countries that will keep eroding me because they'll throw money at it. Subsidized, in other words. I can't be in those industries. I've got to be in industries where I have the IP. I have the American entrepreneurial innovation that's going on. And I've got to recreate that through incubation hubs around the country. Well, we've named them. We've named them locations, we put them in a report, 11 of these. We've had the best universities in America on this team, we had some of the leading companies in America on this team, and they are ready to go.
And what are you waiting for, government?
That means jobs, by the way.
But are you waiting for government investment?
No, I'm waiting for government to make a decision. I'm launching the report.
Also, cheap energy.
Cheap energy was one of them. Sustainable manufacturing based on cheap inputs is the American domain. Just look at our company. I spent $2 billion since 1995 on sustainable manufacturing based on energy efficiency. I have returned $20 billion to the company. Okay, that's Dow. Okay, that's technology we already have in America that the Chinese want, the Singaporeans want, everyone else wants. We have technology advantage that we do it in some industries, like John's, but we are poor in putting it together in others. Why? Because the market is cruel. Okay, you're right, Lloyd. The market is cruel, And capital is a coward. It doesn't like uncertainty. Why are we spending all this government money, okay, in research and development that never commercializes in America?
That's right. How would you
commercializes in
change?
China?
So would you do what countries like Singapore do, which is have the government invest in incubation hubs?
Look, I have 60 federal agencies regulating me. Give me a break. You think you've got a problem? I have 280.
I think you're low.
Okay, maybe. I have 284 new regulations coming at me where we weren't consulted until the very last minute. You want to talk about how government's working, okay? That will add $1 billion a year of new cost to my line if they all get enacted.
Which unfortunately means you're going to take down your expenses by $1 billion. But let's turn back to where you're leading us. If you lose manufacturing from a country, R&D follows. You lose R&D, you lose the headquarters. You lose the small companies, the big companies. We've got to bring it back to America.
Scientists,
and by the
engineers.
way, Western Europe has to do the same thing. Same thing, Japan. So it's how do we deal with these problems together? Because you play out this hand, unless we reverse it, it's not a
But
pretty
how
picture.
do you do it, John? Because if you look at Silicon Valley, one of the unspoken parts about Silicon Valley is a lot of it was built on the back of the defense industry, in the sense of that's why the engineers were in California. There was all this demand that came out of, it created a kind of human capital hub. The federal government bought every semiconductor that was produced in the 1940s and 50s. What is the role of government that is appropriate to helping this next generation of growth?
First, just a mathematical fact. Wherever governments have spent a lot of incentives for future real research, those are the economies that do well 10, 15, 20 years later. Don't pick the winners and losers, but stimulate the universities to do it. And Stanford is a great example of that. Why does Stanford produce 25% of the companies I buy? It's because they really get the creative ideas. But the point that we're all making is once you get this engine or flywheel started, it feeds on itself.
That's it.
And there's very little input to the current companies that are coming out of Silicon Valley. You've got a machine that works, you've got great universities, you've got a workforce that will take good business risk, you've got a government that most of the time stays out of the way, and when appropriate says here's what you have to do different, and capital that gets allocated very quickly, and there is a risk-taking attitude that's the envy of the world with a good hit rate.
And immigrants
have
been very important. That's an important
It really
resource
is.
also.
Talk about it.
It really is.
Well, I was once, again, pandering to my hosts in China. I was saying, of course, things are going, so well here because look, you get to draw on 1.3 billion talented people, and without skipping a beat, he said, that's not our advantage, it's your advantage. You get to draw on 7 billion talented people because all of my 1.3 would move to the United States, and they would. And that's a tremendous asset that the United States has. By the way, it doesn't come from nothing. It comes from what Andrew was saying, this being the best place. In other words, the market does vote with its feet, literally feet, because people do come here. So for all these problems and all these issues, the United States is still the best place to come and to invest. People invest their careers here, and they'd come. What we have to do is not turn every one of those people into a salmon trying to swim upstream, make it so hard for them that it's really, really tough. And I think that's another issue that's in the hands of government that's being held up a little bit, securing these visas, because if you look at Google, if you look at these, a lot of this stuff was spawned by immigrants, and a lot more would be. That kind of talent will find its way into the United States. And by the way, more than energy, that's the most important resource of this country.
So just the math on it. 50%. I agree. 50% of the engineers at Cisco in Silicon Valley are first or second generation of Asian descent. Each job we add in engineering, we add at least one more job to the company and probably 2 to 3 to the supply chain that goes with it. This is what we are the best at in the world, is attracting that talent. We got to make sure we don't slow it down.
So when you listen to Republican rhetoric on immigration, what do you think?
I think that there is more than enough willingness to pass a bill to allowing anyone with a college education, after having gone through a security check, and especially if there's a corporate sponsor, to come to this country. We're getting tangled up, using a West Virginia term, in our underwear about making it so complex rather than getting to the basic issue. Let's deal with this one step at a time. We can't solve world hunger on all the immigration issues, but let's address the one that will create jobs and realize how many new companies will be founded out of that. And there's enough votes on both the Republicans and the Democratic side if they just take this one transaction and put it through.
That's the high skills immigration, doubling of the number.
Absolutely. And it isn't about green cards. It's about we ought to invite them to become part of our country, which is what makes us great.
And they want to be.
Let's quickly talk about Clinton Global Initiative and the projects that you guys are doing. Lloyd, I know you have something you do with women's empowerment. That's very important.
Well, we have a 10,000 women's program, very important for us. That's where we're investing in the business education of women around the world, particularly in emerging markets. We do this through a lot of partners. We create a business curriculum that's appropriate for the country in which they're operating. We partner with local partners. We partner with other business schools in the United States that help us design those programs and to implement those programs. We also support, in many cases, with access to capital. And what we found out is if you make these investments, particularly in women, you should make these investments in everyone, but we found this as a place that was really underserved and one in which you get a lot of leverage, because in many of these countries, if you support women, you pick up the family and you pick up people who are very community organized and in grow businesses. It's not so much philanthropy as it is an investment that leads to more hiring and more businesses and more entrepreneurialism. And something we have in our businesses, we have to represent something. And we have confidence in business and capitalism and what investment returns. So we need something that also speaks to a little bit of our ideology and also can help galvanize the people in our own firm so that we're not merely writing checks, but we're getting our own people engaged in a process that supports the kind of the ideology of our own business and what we have elected to do with our own lives to support the society.
Andrew, when you look at the kind of issues that the Clinton Global Initiative does, where does Dow fit in?
Well, we've been here 5 years and made a commitment every year. Parallel to this session is our commitment for this year, which is to work with the Acumen Fund. It's a great fund in Africa that is bringing solutions, sustainable energy solutions, to the communities of Africa, East and West Africa in this case. And we have something called the Dow Sustainability Corps. It's employee-based. We take our employees, they volunteer. We send them around the world to do community projects around the world for a year. We pay for it all. We're merging that effort with the Acumen Fund in East and West Africa for sustainable energy solutions. Water Health International was the first commitment we made 5 years ago. It's now 40% owned Dow subsidiary, but when it started, it wasn't. It was just an NGO. In essence, this is now a for-profit, community-based water provider. 1 million villagers in India and Africa getting clean water that weren't getting clean water before. That helps the women's issue substantially too, because it's the women who go and get the water from the rivers. So that's just two examples. On the general nature of collaboration, this voice of business, we've announced something with the Nature Conservancy, which is huge, which is we're putting together economic models, and Goldman Sachs is helping us a bit with this, how to value nature in business decisions. We have to move from the notion of grey infrastructure, which is waste treatment, end-of-pipe facilities, to green infrastructure. How to use wetlands, how to use forests, how to use air, how to use shade, how to use everything nature provides us in the decisions we make in cities and factories on when to site a factory and when to site even expansions of cities, urbanization. That collaborative activity is modeling the largest industrial complex in America is in Freeport, Texas, if you didn't know. Massive industrial facility down there. We own a lot of it. And there's 10 engineers and scientists who are developing this model, which we're going to make free to the world, so that people who are designing factories around the world can use this model to make value-based decisions on the value of nature.
John, you're very big on cooperation between business and government. You see this as a crucial forum for that reason?
I think absolutely. The first commitment we made at the Clinton Global Initiative, when my team came back and said, here's what we're going to do on the environment and cut our emissions by 25% in 3 years, I said, I don't think we can do that. And I knew that President Clinton never forgets a number, so he's going to hold us accountable for it. But what it does is make you say, the way we're headed, you can't accomplish these goals. And it's by thinking out of the box that makes a difference. What we have to do, however, is learn how to scale quicker. Our network academies, for example, we often work with governments around the world and with the Clinton Global Initiative in certain countries. We train 1 million students a year. Every student gets 20 to 50% more pay. And interestingly enough, to the point that Lloyd made on gender, in the Muslim world, 27% of the students are women. In the U.S., it's only 16%. And so it is the ability to get outside of our comfort zone, which I think the president gets us into regularly, dream what is possible, which is what I think this is all about, get groups that never work together between NGOs and between business and government and say, let's solve this quickly. And then the one area that I think we must do better, we've got to learn how to scale it. I think we get a lot of good projects started. It's how do we scale on a global basis faster that I would encourage us to do better.
Okay, since I have you, John Chambers, I'm going to ask you a question that most people are wondering. So if everybody watches video on the internet, how on earth is the system not going to crash? Give us a glimpse into the future. Give us a glimpse into the future of the pipes that run the internet.
Well, the exciting thing, it isn't video. You haven't seen anything yet. The majority of video you will consume 5 years from now will be user-created as opposed to content created. We built a router that does 1 billion videos. One router. We built a router 8 years ago that did a billion phone calls. We sold 6,000 of them. The problem will not be capacity of the technology. The key will be how do we consume it. And if you get excited about that, you haven't seen anything yet. You look at what could happen if you connect the unconnected. And you begin to do this not just through video, but through common capability. In a plant, you connect 50,000 IP devices. The finance industry, think what could happen if you could bring your loans out in a very unique way. So you're just getting started in terms of what the internet could be. And back to a plug for President Clinton, which he does not need. He was the champion of the internet. He got how important it was to lead with this concept in 1992, and he was the best spokesperson.
Not Al Gore?
Al helped him a little bit. But you haven't seen it. If you think that's a challenge, it gets even more excited.
All right. You haven't seen anything yet. That's a good optimistic note to end on. Thank you very much.
Thank you.